Have you been hanging with us? You know we're journeying through Jesus' famous teaching, often called the Sermon on the Mount, and we've titled it, Be Wise, Build Well, because Jesus finishes the whole teaching or the whole sermon with the analogy of the wise man who builds on the rock versus the foolish man who builds on the sand, and in essence shows us that the whole teaching, the whole sermon has been about how we order and build our lives. And so we're reading that back in as we go along, and we've been dealing with some interesting topics as we go through this, to say the least, and thanks for hanging in there and hopefully seeing them as chosen by Jesus for a reason, not to elevate that situation in some way, but to get to heart issues underneath some of these things. And as we transition just a little bit this morning to a different kind of reference to the Old Testament law, we are still going to see that Jesus is once again driving at the heart issue that lies beneath some of these things. So, if you have a copy of the Scriptures, you can turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. If not, no worries, we'll have it on the screen for you. Just a couple of verses this morning. You've heard that it was said, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, then hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Word of God for the people of God. Now, what is Jesus talking about here? Well, he references this law code that says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's sometimes called by scholars the lex talionis, right? Lex meaning law of equality. And so the idea is 1 for 1. And this wasn't just a law in the Mosaic Code. It exists there, right? You can find it at Exodus and in Deuteronomy. But this was common law across the entire ancient Near East. And archaeologists have discovered this by discovering remnants and relics and codes from other ancient empires that even predate Israel as a nation. And it was just commonplace, and in many ways continues to be semi-common today. The idea being, if you inflict damage on someone, they have the right to inflict equal damage on you. If you pluck the eye out of one, then you should expect to have your eye plucked out as well. What's fascinating is that the Mosaic Code, the Mosaic Law Code, which you remember, and we have to remember some of this, right, is that when the law is being established by God to Moses for the people, it's not just a set of spiritual ideals or religious rules. They're ordering a society, right? These are people who are going to live together as a nation. And so many of the laws have to do with that, and that's why there's overlap. But in all the other ancient Near East societies, this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing was a class-based reality. So it was only really an eye for an eye if you were an equal societal peer of someone. What the Mosaic Code does is it elevates it and moves it to say, no, there is no classes, that if this is what has been done, then that's what can be expected. And now Jesus is wanting to dig back into this reality and get underneath to some of the heart matter that's happening here. Because here's the truth. That law, I guess, it exists for the chance that someone plucks your eye out. But it also is means of stating something that has to do with retribution, right? That is that what's been done to you, you can expect fair retribution for. And that's the base of law. And so it extends not just to physical violence against someone, but all the way down into all the matters of living together in societal form so that people are protected and well cared for. And so Jesus really is going to invoke some of those lesser things. Like he's not going to be talking about eyeballs and teeth, right? He's going to be talking about more practical realities of what tends to happen sometimes in society where it used to be dealt with by a law like this, but he's calling us to some level of heart transformation to see how we engage with other people differently than perhaps we ordinarily would have previous. That Jesus is calling for a heart level shift of allegiance to kingdoms. Right? What is the basis of retribution? Why do we seek retribution? Because someone has harmed me, right? Someone has attacked Kingdom Adam. And therefore, retribution will be sought. And Jesus, I would suggest to you, is asking for you and for me and for his disciples in his first century world to shift off of the kingdom of self onto the kingdom of God. And it is not just a theological shift, it's a heart shift. And you say, well, that sounds like some of what he's already been talking about. Yeah, that's kind of the big idea, isn't it? Away from me, myself, and I, pride-based living, which is foolish building, and on to kingdom living. Jesus is king. He's the rock. That's the right kingdom. And that's the right kind of construction. And so Jesus is calling for this kind of shift. And what I would suggest to you is it's a shift from retribution to grace and mercy. Now, why not just one word? Well, in many ways, grace and mercy are two words that are inextricably bound in so many ways. That grace is, at some level, getting what you don't deserve, and mercy is not getting what you do deserve. But almost all of the time, it's some concoction of the two in response to others or coming towards us. And what we'll see here is that Jesus is calling for a heart-level shift away from retribution, what'd you do to me, to grace and mercy, what is my obligation to you? You see the very difference that is happening here in the foundational way. And of course, at the core, we know this because we understand everything that's happened beyond Matthew 5, that what Jesus is actually asking us to do is be gospel-centered people. Because this transition is only made possible because of Jesus himself. Remember, Jesus, who is God, comes to earth amidst a whole host of rebellious and broken people, you and me included. And he stands there and announces his arrival and demands retribution, right? Is that the gospel? Or is the gospel a Jesus who stunningly says to Nicodemus and other people like him, I've not come here actually to condemn you. Instead, I've come to save you, to rescue you, to offer you mercy and grace in place of demanding retribution. Jesus is going to live this out, embody it, and make it possible long before he holds it as a standard for us. So the truth is the same as we've talked about every single week. If you leave here today saying, well, Pastor Adam said I've got to do X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to try harder at that, then you will have missed the point completely. The point is, what has God actually done to me? What is my picture of who God is on the basis of Jesus? What comes to my mind when I think about God will transform how I live amongst other people. The bigger point to be made is, how deeply have you received the grace and mercy of our God? Or do you still see him in some way demanding of you? And the level to which you understand that is the level of openness in which you have opened yourself towards heart-level transformation. Does this make sense? And so what does Jesus then follow up and say? You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I've come to tell you, don't even resist an evil person. Now that sounds horrible, right? We have to parse this out a little bit. And once again, I suggest to you, it's really important to read a sermon contextually. In the same way, listen to you, I'm not equating myself on any way with Jesus, with the exception that he preached a sermon and I currently am preaching a sermon, right? The comparison ends there. However, if someone picks up this sermon, 2,000 years from now and reads it, the context of 2024 at some level is going to speak profoundly into what I'm saying and how we're relating to it. In the very same way, we do a misjustice if we don't understand what Jesus is saying in a first century context to first century people, and instead pull things out and say, well, this is the new mandate. Turn the other cheek, Just give everything to everyone, Well, we have to be very thoughtful about how we parse this out and understand it so that we see that Jesus is again driving towards a heart issue, and he's going to use certain things to expose our heart problem, not necessarily to hold as religious standards over our heads. Does this make sense? It doesn't mean that we ought not live this way. Obviously, we should. But Jesus is not replacing an old law with a new law that is about God's retribution. It's about the transformation of who we are. So he says, don't resist an evil person. Now listen, some people have built whole theologies of pacifism on the basis of this, and there's whole segments of Christianity that actually would say that they won't engage in any kind of response to violence because of verses like this. And I want to suggest to you that that's probably an unfair way to read this passage of Scripture. It's taking a point and blowing it up in an abundant way that probably is unnecessary. Now, I'm not saying that to cast judgment on anyone who takes that view of life or any way, but we still have a Jesus who in other places is talking about taking up swords and things like that, right? And so we have to put all of these things together. Is that Jesus is talking in very particular ways about how we respond to people who have done wrong to us, and or we'll see actually people who we have done wrong to as well. Typically on a somewhat tame scale. In other words, he's not talking about, I guess I should just come out with it and not talk around it. He's not saying to people who are being abused, hey, just keep taking it, right? This is ridiculous. He would never say that. He's not saying to people, yeah, you know what it means to be a Christian? Eternal status as a doormat. This is not what he's talking about, right? That's not what any of this means. It means in a moment, how does our heart respond to a person? It does not mean we continue to subject ourselves to things, but it's a heart question in the moment. And in many ways, it's meant to expose the brokenness of our heart, not prove the worthiness of our heart. Follow me? Are we making sense here? So he says, listen, don't even resist an evil person. The word resist is probably not the best of translations. It's a hard word to translate from the original language. It was often used in terms of litigation or legal processes. So the idea was, don't take this person to court, right? Why it's not translated that is because it's not just about legal cases or court cases. The idea is, don't make a case out of this, right? We have that kind of lingo or idiom in our modern English language. So what would it mean for you not to prosecute this person either through the legal system or more specifically, as Jesus is referencing here, I think, in some kind of public way to defend your personal honor? Does this make sense? So again, don't mishear me. Someone assaults you, well, you shouldn't call the police because that might lead to courts. No, you should. We have a society, there are wrong choices, and wrong choices have punishments and consequences. Jesus is speaking to your heart. He's not speaking in other ways. So he says, don't have a heart that always wants to just crush anyone who comes at you. Don't have a heart that's going to pursue them in order to prove yourself. Don't have a heart that needs to show why everything they've done is wrong and everything you are is right. Don't have a me kingdom mindset, but have a God's kingdom mindset. Don't resist even evil. Now listen, again, I think you get the nuance here, but let me say it as bluntly as I can. There are plenty of places in the New Testament where we are called to resist evil. Right? This is not a blanket statement against not resisting evil. Jesus is talking contextually about people who are confronting us or are on us or are after us or whatever it might be, and he's talking to our hearts. And so he gives us, as it were, 4 practical examples. Now, they might not seem all that practical to us. They might seem elevated to us, and I suppose at some level they are. But they are meant to demonstrate how a transformed heart might approach that issue in that moment. Ready for these? First one, turn the other cheek, right? No one likes this. Let's just be honest. Let's get it out there, right? No one likes this, and everyone's, some of you aren't here this morning because you knew it was coming next. Turn the other cheek. Ugh, I'm an American. We don't do that stuff. Well, let's be honest again about what's happening here. The language is very explicit. And whenever authors are explicit when they normally are not, that should be, as readers, flashing lights to us that this matters. This is important. So what does he say? So whenever someone strikes you on the right cheek, right? Now what is that all about? Well, in the first century Jewish world, the way that you get struck on the right cheek is to be a backhanded slap across the face. Because you struck someone with your right hand almost always, because most everyone was right-handed. And to hit someone's right cheek then would be to slap them across the face with a backhand. And what it was in that day, in that age, was a very public insult. Okay? So let's get underneath here. Like, is Jesus talking to you about an instance of someone smacking you across the face? Maybe. I don't know. You're going to have to nuance that. Is he talking to you about being publicly insulted? 1,000%. Right? 1,000%. So how are you going to respond to that? Jesus says, well, a transformed heart actually is going to be inclined to turn the other cheek. So almost all the time we'll hear this as, okay, hit me again. And maybe that's what it means, but really at the core what it means is what? Don't engage, right? Don't engage. Don't respond. Don't eye for an eye it. Oh, you did that to me? Here it comes right back at you. Well, because if you do that, what happens? It's coming right back at you, and the cycle continues on and on. Jesus is calling you to stop the cycle, break it in the name of the kingdom of God, even though it leaves something hanging, right? And what is the thing that it leaves hanging? Your reputation sometimes, your social status, what those who are around you are perceiving on the basis of that. Listen, for many of us, at times we're happy to turn the other cheek and move on, but then we circle everyone up and say, hey, what that person said, let me explain to you, blah, 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 right? And here's the idea, friends, that anyone who has a settled identity has very little need to defend themselves. And Jesus is saying, as followers of me, you have a settled identity. You should feel no need to defend yourself. And look at the earthly ministry and life of Jesus. He is almost always never defending himself. And he is routinely being publicly insulted, right? At the level of being called the devil himself. And Jesus is going to speak truth, but not on a level of personally defending himself. Even to the end in his trials, when he's being accused of things and very humbly and gently says, well, it's as you say. You know? That Jesus' life and his actions of mercy and grace are actually the things that are going to define him, not his social status, popularity, amassing of stuff. What would it mean at a heart level for you not to live your life in a way that is constantly defending yourself? So many of us, and listen, I got my hand up right here in front of you. This is the kind of way we build our lives, isn't it? So the world can see who I am. And anyone that's going to come striking at that, I'm going to resist. Or I'm going to prove to be wrong. And Jesus is actually saying, what if you had a heart that at some level lamented the reality that this person has to behave in this way? You say, who would ever do that? Well, you remember on the cross when Jesus, somewhat surprisingly, says, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. Do you believe that about your common man? That at some level, they don't even know what they're doing. They have no idea of who God is and what He's done through Jesus. And so they're striving in every way. Why are they hurling insults at you? Because they're trying to build a self-image for themselves. That's the only reason people do it. And what if you said, actually, I'm not in that game. I have a settled identity. And instead, I'm going to respond to you in grace and mercy. That might, at the very core, just mean giving a smile and moving on. Or maybe even continuing to engage them in love and mercy that's not pursuing retribution or retaliation. Listen, we could spend the whole rest of our time together parsing this particular thing out in all the different ways it happens in our world, but I trust you with it. Right? So what's the second example that Jesus gives? Is, listen, if someone sues you and they ask for your shirt, give them your coat too. Again, weird, right? Who would want my shirt? And if they want my shirt, why also would they want my coat? But in the first century world, people owned, unless they were super rich, people owned like 2, 3 shirts, right? It was kind of the thing they wore. And they owned one coat, and if you were poor, your coat might have been the most valuable thing you had. In fact, it probably was the thing that kept you warm at night in the cold months. So what's fascinating is that the law says that the courts or a person could never ask for another person's coat because of that reason. And Jesus is saying, hey, what if you just gave it to them freely? Now, I think the only way we can understand this is to see that in this case, Jesus is suggesting that we might find ourselves at times being the one who has done wrong, right? This is the scenario here. If someone is rightly accused us of something and has asked for some kind of repayment for it, a shirt, as it were, Jesus is saying, give them your coat. In other words, respond appropriately to the ways in which we have wronged people. How does the retribution mindset respond to people we've wronged? Well, give them what I'm told I have to, right? Instead of acknowledging the hurt and the pain of the wrong and going above and beyond to demonstrate grace and mercy to someone. Again, how does this play out in your lives? My guess is, I'm going to go beyond guess, my sincere hope is that very few to none of us will ever be sued in a court of law. And my guess is in a court of law, if you are sued, it will not be for your shirt. So we're talking at a heart level about real case things here. So what happens when you wrong your child as a parent? When you speak harshly and sternly to them? When you speak to them out of your own pride instead of out of genuine love? What's the code as a parent in that situation? Well, there is none, right? Well, they know I'm having a bad day. Maybe. Or would this principle of Jesus mean seeking them out, sitting them down, looking them in the eyes and saying, you know what? What I did was completely wrong. I have been having a hard day, but I spoke to you in pride and in arrogance. I didn't consider you at all. I love you. I'm so sorry that I did that to you. Would you forgive me? You ever done that, parent? I mean, that should regularly be happening as a Christian parent, unless you are living some kind of parenting messiahship. Children, I know none of you are in here, so play this back to the kids later. Likewise, right? But parents, you're setting the culture in a household, in friendships, right? In marital relationships, amongst your coworkers, to your neighbors, whatever it might be. What if you went a little above and beyond to pursue that reality? It's important stuff. Then Jesus says, listen, if anyone asks you to carry their things for a mile, I say go 2 miles. Now, again, this is weird stuff. We do get our saying, go the extra mile. Where? From right here, right? Why on earth is he asking? Did people actually have to do this in the first century world? Yeah, you better believe it, right? And this wasn't, there's no chapter and verse in Exodus or Deuteronomy. This is a Roman rule. Because the Roman occupiers said of the local citizens, at any moment, a Roman military person could demand a local carry their equipment for a mile, which in Roman measures was like 1,000 paces. And Jesus is saying, even if that happens to you, go a second mile. Now think about that for just a minute. Again, it's an interesting history lesson. This will never happen to us, right? He's speaking to Jewish people who probably their greatest frustration in life was the fact that the Romans were hanging around and taxing them to no end and showing their might in so many ways. And all they wanted, they wanted God's return, all these things, but a huge part of that was to get Rome out. And so here's this would-be Messiah saying, actually, when they oppress you, lean into it a little bit. Yowzers. How does that sit with you? At some level, let's speak 2024 American, right? I know we speak English, but I'm talking about our particular culture. How does this work for us? It's all about my rights, man, right? I got my rights, and therefore, I'm going to live by my rights. And Jesus, at some level, is saying, yeah, except. You bear with me for 20 seconds if I scrape off a somewhat beginning to be hardened wound or scar or a scab for some of us. Remember when we were all asked to wear masks? And for some of us, that was really hard and challenging, and you did it anyway. And at some level, I think that reality is what Jesus is talking about in this moment. It's not just about, again, being a doormat for the oppressing Romans, right? It's not letting them beat people up and whatever. But what would it mean to those who are in authority over you that issue you a decree that you're like, I don't think so. If instead you said, okay, but what if I demonstrate a willingness to serve and to love even in that moment? What does that mean at your workplace? Just doing the bare minimum? Listen, I'm not asking you to be a workaholic or to do things you're not getting compensated for or whatever, but what's your heart in those places? For college students, you've got that one professor who's like an oppressing Roman, right? What does it mean to change your heart attitude towards that professor and not see them through that lens, but as someone who could be loved and respected and honored, even though they're acting in a harsh way? These are the kinds of things that Jesus is talking about on a very practical level. And they ought to be things that we could literally sit down with a journal and spend the rest of our lives finding ways in which this applies to us. Because it's a heart issue. It's not, here are the 4 new rules. Turn the other cheek. I didn't even get to the 4th one, did I? Jesus says, listen, if anyone asks you for money, just give it to them. Again, we have to read this contextually, right? Jesus, St. Augustine famously said, he's asking you to give, not give everything. So again, what Augustine means by that is you have to read it contextually and you have to understand it in your means and your ability. The issue that Jesus is calling us here to is not giving money to everyone who asks for it, or if someone asks for something, giving them everything we have. The issue is, what is your heart doing when someone asks you for something? Jesus says, do you have a heart that turns away or turns towards? That the heart is what he cares about, not how much money you're giving or if you're buying dinner or whatever the means is in that moment. But where's your heart? How is that happening? Are you more characterized by retribution or by mercy and grace? Jesus is calling for a profound heart shift for his followers that is deeply rooted in a right understanding of who God actually is, and therefore who he's calling us to be. Fascinating little literary reality happening here, that in these 4 examples, he starts out with a turning towards and he ends with a turning towards. Right? Turn the other cheek means turning in towards that person, looking at them. And here again, don't turn away. So therefore, turn in. And in so many ways, literarily, we can see that this is the driving point for Jesus. That are you just fully occupied with yourself? Turn away. Are you willing to lean in to the reality of the people around you? Even the ones who make life challenging at times. Is this working? There we go. It's working again. Sorry. Jesus definitively picks 4 examples that are challenging, right? It's not like, hey, when your neighbor invites you over and they've cooked your favorite meal, like maybe go, you know? Like, no, what happens when someone insults you in public? What happens when someone posts something inflammatory on Instagram or Facebook? Maybe don't engage, right? But can I let you in on something about social media? You might have the most informed and the most eloquent opinion to share. You will change no one's mind. Turn the other cheek. Everyone who is on there is only looking for people to affirm what they're already saying. Show them a different way. Respond to them with a different question that moves to their heart and demonstrates grace and mercy. What if we were different kinds of people? Jesus says, listen, here's your identity, salt and light. I've left you here, as it were, on purpose, right? Why doesn't Jesus just, after we believe, and why doesn't he just take us and we'll be with him forever? That's coming, but I've left you here on purpose now for a reason. Why? To be salt and light. To live a certain way that is incredibly countercultural. But it's not just about following a bunch of whole new rules. It's about having a different heart. And in this way, a heart that is not bent towards my rights, my kingdom, myself, my stuff, my status, but instead is bent towards God's kingdom and therefore sees themselves as agents of grace and mercy where and when possible. Imagine if we live this way. Imagine if the world saw Christians living this way. The profound impact that it could and would have. And this is our call. Jesus says, unless you have a righteousness that is greater than the scribes and the Pharisees, you're toast. And then he says, listen, if you're seeking retribution in any way, yikes, right? Once again, exposing to us the depth of the brokenness of our heart and offering to us his righteousness that can and will transform us. So let me close by asking you 3 questions for you to ponder this week. First question, how deeply do you know the gospel? At what level, when you think about God, does grace and mercy just come rushing into your understanding? Or at some level, do you still see him as pursuing retribution? Nothing will change until that changes. We need the gospel. Second question, how would you characterize the way in which you are building your life? Is it a kingdom for yourself? Is it largely characterized by retribution, by my rights, getting what I deserve, making sure I'm getting a fair shake in every single thing? Or, first of all, could you imagine if that was what motivated Jesus, right? Or is it characterized increasingly by living for the kingdom of God and finding freedom there? Are you finding yourself moving in grace and mercy in ways that if you look back on your life 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, like, God had never done that. That's gospel transformation. That's right and wise building. Last question. Where is it that God has uniquely placed you? What are the spheres of influence? Where do the insults sometimes come from? Where are you inclined sometimes to be the agitator or the wrongdoer? Where are those who are over you sometimes lording it over you just a little bit? Where do you find people asking you for help? And how does your heart respond? In every moment, we should be asking ourselves hard questions like that. Not to condemn ourselves. If Jesus did not come to condemn you, you also then are not allowed to condemn yourself. But instead, to regularly in this broken world reckon with two truths. One, my heart is irreparably broken. I will always lean towards retribution on my own. And therefore, I need Jesus. But two, as a redeemed son or daughter of the King, I am being transformed and finding my responses over time being increasingly different, increasingly other, increasingly grace and mercy. This is who we are. Will you pray with me?